Local journalism is potentially on the verge of collapse, and while there are plenty of journalists who are talking about it, it feels like no one is actually listening.
The entire journalism industry is basically in a free fall.
That's right. The layoffs are already piling up this year, and we're just a few weeks into 2024.
And it's not just digital media sites. Local news has been obliterated.
Every month we see newspapers close down, whole newsrooms shut down.
The loss of thousands of local newspapers across the country is depriving communities of some of the glue that holds them together.
And that's probably because news consumption and trust in mass media is likely at its lowest point that it has been in the last 30 years.
But in the last couple weeks, we've started to see it collapse before our eyes.
Today, the Los Angeles Times laid off 115 employees. They wiped out their entire DC bureau in an election year.
Not just your Vice, you've got your BuzzFeed, ESPN, News Corp, Disney.
NPR, ABC News, The Wall Street Journal, Adweek, or even the hallowed halls of Vice Media and Sports Illustrated, both of which had their entire staffs eliminated in just the past few months.
Pretty much the entire digital media ecosystem that myself and a lot of other millennial journalists came up in has been completely hollowed out.
What's next for the state of media?
Okay, and I know what you're thinking. Carolyn, that's great and all, but this is a startup and tech show. Why are you talking about journalism? Two reasons. First, startups and tech are largely responsible for this current collapse. But second, journalism really needs help with two things that startups are tremendously good at: building better business models and getting a lot of attention. Today, I want to talk about how the rise of the internet and big tech has severely damaged the journalism industry, but I also want to talk about potential solutions. The reality is, I know my audience, and you guys are a whole bunch of tech and startup nerds. And building startups is all about solving big and messy problems. So if you're looking for a juicy, spooky, scary problem to solve, I highly consider that you watch this video. And so this is the question that we are tackling today. How can journalism innovate and survive while business models lag behind and misinformation and news avoidance thrives? And what can we do to help? Let's find out. Local journalism in the United States appears to be on the verge of collapse, and many experts are wondering if we are headed towards an extinction level event within the next year or so.
Since 2005, we have lost 1/3 of all newspapers in the country and 2/3 of newspaper journalists. 2.5 local newspapers closed every single week last year. That means the newspaper in your city where you live.
There are a whole host of reasons about why this is happening, but it is primarily because the current business models that journalism has been using for kind of centuries are currently failing. Now, contrary to popular belief, somehow journalism has always been a bit more of a vocation rather than a get-rich-quick type of a scheme. Most journalists make very little money, especially in recent decades, with the exception of a handful of big-name television celebrities. Think people like Tucker Carlson or Anderson Cooper. But the reality is those mega salaries are not true for the vast majority of journalists all across the country. And the reason for this is because journalism is an incredibly expensive business.
And you know what? People are cynical about this. They say, who cares? We've got social media. Who needs those lazy, biased reporters anyway? Well, guess what? I do, and so do you, because I think people misunderstand what it is that journalists actually do. News doesn't just appear on your Twitter or Facebook feed. Somebody needs to find it.
Obviously, you need to pay writers to write, but there's actually a lot more behind the scenes than most people really consider. For every news story that you have, you need to find a journalist or a few journalists to go out into the field, find stories, validate their sources, record or collect any data that's needed, and also find people who can speak to their experiences, which are often incredibly traumatic, and with people who may or may not really want to share. Journalism has traditionally been funded and still is funded primarily by ad revenue. However, with the switch from print to radio to television to the internet, news organizations get less ad revenue directly, which has led the news organizations to flounder and try to find new business models. On top of that, the amount of people who actually follow the news has gone substantially down in the last several years. Why is this happening? A few reasons. First, news habits have been dramatically changing over the last several years. Cable was already cutting into print's ad revenue for a long time, well before the internet showed up. And news organizations launching everything onto the internet initially for free led to people expecting to have free content from them on the internet forever. Because obviously ad revenue could cover that, right?
Same thing with free news, right? That was a problem for all subscription businesses. What media thought was that they didn't have to be good at technology. And that was a real problem because they thought the technologists would never want their businesses.
And on top of that, there is so much content online. There are so many things to do. There are endless buttons to click. Why on earth would you pay money to find content that is going to make you sad? Which leads to one of our biggest and newest issues in journalism, which is news apathy. People don't want to consume the news anymore because frankly, it's too depressing. Which 100%, the news is just absolutely insane. And while I don't mean to spill any tea, part of this is more of a political problem than a news problem, because frankly, we have politicians who do what exactly? Now, does this mean that the world itself has actually gotten worse? Probably not, but it's also debatable. But the biggest issue is that the 24/7 news cycle that we all inhabit nowadays does seem to be very bad for our brains. And I do think this is a major reason that we are having a mental health crisis in this country and in various places across the globe. So how did this happen? Is it all tech's fault or something else? I decided to phone a friend, a local startup founder here in Minneapolis named Chuck Peters. Now, before you ask about whether or not this is the same Chuck Peters who was in my most recent TikTok ban video, no, it's not. It's totally not the same person. Look, he's wearing glasses, which is totally different. And my hair is just always this fabulous. Duh.
So my first question for you is, what does journalism look like today, and dare I say, how bad is it?
Journalism is, let's just call it in a media apocalypse. What's happened over the last 20 to 30 years is we've went from more consolidated media to now a fractured media environment, partially due to the internet and the techification of news. Information now travels extremely fast, and what you see over the course of history is that whenever a new invention, technological innovation comes along that allows information to be spread very quickly, it can have some very positive and very negative impacts on how people consume information, specifically with local news. Very big media companies like the New York Times, the LA Times, who have found ways to succeed, and you see at the very small end, like your very niche papers, like we'll call it like Downtown Voices or the community paper, who doesn't necessarily have to offer subscriptions, but can stick with their very niche audience and not see necessarily a ton of growth, but they can see their business succeeding. What you see is the companies in the middle who don't really have a very good identity, where they're not a very large enterprise that has a big audience and then can find other ways to monetize off of it. And they also don't have a very niche coverage model where they can carry an audience very loyally, and those are the people that we're starting to see. And so local papers are closing at an alarming rate. It's gone up from 2 every year to now 2.5 every year. That problem gets even worse as you get outside of the most dense populations, like the metropolitan areas and the Twin Cities. As you get more north, like northern Minnesota and other rural parts of the United States, so we're seeing more and more news deserts come up as time goes on.
The internet was and is wonderful for a wide variety of reasons. It was easier than ever for people to find or learn whatever it was that they wanted to find and learn. And it was easier than ever for brands to learn and find out more about you. Hooray, data! But this led to an avalanche of changes. News habits dramatically changed. News organizations started losing money in industries that they thought would never lose money and would go on into infinity. And even when news organizations and online content businesses started seeing major successes online, social media giants realized something. Whenever people clicked on an ad or a post that led to a different content website, so let's say you're on Facebook and you go to YouTube, or you're on Facebook and you go to the New York Times website, or you're on Facebook and you go to Tumblr. They realized that when people left for more content-based websites rather than, just shopping for, shoes, that people were way less likely to go back to the social media platform, or in this example, Facebook. So what did they do? They stopped promoting content from other content websites.
Some companies like Mother Jones and BuzzFeed News have tried to lean into the social media and news sites like Google News to drive more traffic from those sites to their website. However, the issue with that is that whenever those algorithms change and Google and Facebook decide they're no longer going to prioritize news, it turns off the spigot for those companies that relied on a lot of the ad traffic, where, for example, Mother Jones, their digital Facebook traffic is down 99% from its peak a couple years ago, and are struggling to
and
keep their doors
BuzzFeed
open.
News no longer exists.
And BuzzFeed News no longer exists, that's right.
And to be fair, this isn't just Facebook, this is all social media platforms collectively. If you post, say, a news article on those platforms, you'll notice that they get substantially less likes and views and comments than you would get if you just posted like a cute video of yourself or something natively onto the platform, right? And that's not even mentioning about how social media platforms have radicalized people by putting people in their own isolated social bubbles and leading people down some really scary rabbit holes if they're not careful. So now we're in a situation where the vast majority of people only spend time on the internet and on a few specific websites. These websites are no longer directing people to news organizations' websites. And so the traffic for these news organization websites has gone dramatically down. Misinformation is rampant, and there's massive mistrust of institutional news organizations across the board. So that led me to wonder, where do people get their news these days? The first thing I did was ask around. So I made a poll on LinkedIn, I made a poll on YouTube community posts, which I just discovered that I have, and I made a poll on Instagram stories. And what I loved about this is the numbers that I got 100% lined up with the numbers for how young people consume their news. And that is that the vast majority of young people get their news online or not at all. The big news junkies seem to get their news from online newspapers, which same. A whole lot of people who followed the news sometimes, but not religiously, got their news on social media, so what they saw while scrolling. A lot of people said email newsletters, which I do too, I have too many. A lot of people talked about platforms like YouTube or podcasts or TikTok, which I think is all its own category. And I had one person on LinkedIn who said cable news. So while traditional news organizations are still doing a great job with older Americans, they are severely lacking when it comes to younger Americans. But another reason why people are leaving traditional journalism behind is because of massive mistrust in these institutions. According to Gallup News, only 34% of Americans found the news to be trustworthy in 2022, which is the second lowest ever in comparison to 32% in 2016. What happened that year? Why would people mistrust the news? What? And because this is America, where the only opinions that you have are directly dictated by your political party of choice, yes, this falls completely on party lines, with 70% of Democrats believing that these news institutions are to be trustworthy, while only 14% of Republicans trust the news. Yay, polarization! Now, why does this matter?
When we look at the purpose of journalism, it's important to understand that journalists aren't just responsible for reporting the events of the day. They take on a much larger role in our society as truth tellers and those who shed light on major issues.
So if you look at how government is organized, right, there's one person and there's one vote, and we the people are responsible for making decisions about who represents us, and we're all in this collectively together. Part of the way that we do that is by consuming trustworthy, verified, fact-based content that we can then go out and make decisions in our day-to-day life. Sometimes that's content like, hey, this new restaurant opened up down the street for me. But other times that's content like, how are we going to solve some of the world's leading problems like climate change and gun violence? All of us, as being leaders in our community who are charged with picking representatives and leaders who solve these problems, when we're constantly reading just, hey, here's a problem, here's a problem, here's a problem, and there's not a solution tapered on along with that, we eventually feel that nothing is being done about it. It's a hopeless issue, and we give up, and then we pull back from reading that content altogether as a way to protect ourselves, protect our mental health and our own well-being, so that we don't have this negative outlook on life and this negative outlook on who we are as individuals. All of that to say, we need access to high-quality information that we can then turn into positive action. The primary way of doing that is giving people access to local news that meets them where they're at, offers solutions for how they can get involved, so that they can look back and say, that's where we were, and this is where we are now. I see the progress that we've made. I still see that there's this mountaintop that we need to get to, and the work that we've done is important, and we're going to keep making progress towards that, and that's a key factor of what local news does.
I don't think people understand how bad the world would be without journalists, and the majority of journalists losing their jobs in situations like this are the working journalists that are doing these investigations of police brutality or investigating corporations or holding power to account. I don't want to live in a world where all of the news is delivered through 60-second TikTok videos with retention editing.
This is massively important, and it's because many studies have proven that if people do not have access to news, more specifically, they don't have access to local news, that there are massive increases in corruption, there's massive increases in polarization, and just in conflict in general. People ask me all the time why news matters. This is why. When we cannot agree on facts, we cannot agree on solutions, which means we cannot make the world a better place or hold our government officials or people in power accountable. I wanted to talk about journalism today for a few reasons. First, this affects all of us, whether we realize it or not. I also wanted to talk about this because I think there is a tremendous opportunity for people who are building in tech, for startup founders, or for people in technology to help and try to find ways to solve this problem. The reality is, without technology, we wouldn't have journalism, all right? Technology invented the printing press. Technology invented the radio. Technology invented television. I get really frustrated when people paint technology as being only evil with a really wide brush. I think there are things that technologists have done wrong, and I do think that there are unintended consequences of each piece of technology that is ever made. But that said, I think there is a real opportunity here, and that if somebody can figure out how to solve this problem, that we could see a substantially better future for all of us. And while it's easy to point the finger at tech and say that tech destroyed journalism, the journalism industry also made major mistakes by underestimating the internet.
We let them take over the key parts of the media ecosystem, including digital advertising. And as print or broadcast revenues decline, which is obvious to one and all, they didn't have a second plan. Like this was going to go on forever, and of course things change.
And I will admit, a lot of these traditional media companies have accelerated their own demise. They ignored the internet for years. They're condescending to content creators and people outside their mainstream ecosystem. They constantly kowtow to corporate and political power. They have these false and deluded notions of objectivity, which by the way doesn't exist. But that's not even why a lot of them are going out of business. A lot of them are going out of business fundamentally because the economics of the media ecosystem are broken.
In addition, I have really enjoyed learning about what journalists are doing to try to adapt and what startups are out there. What are people doing to try to turn things around? Many journalists are becoming content creators on platforms like YouTube and TikTok, and tons of independent journalists are making email newsletters on platforms like Substack, and many email newsletter companies like The Morning Brew are starting to make content on platforms like TikTok and YouTube and Instagram, which frankly I feel like is an absolutely hilarious reversal. The New York Times is advertising itself as an app that people use very practically throughout their entire day. The BBC has been experimenting with many different platform styles. And my local paper, the Star Tribune, is getting into sports betting and a whole lot more with a former Google and YouTube exec at the helm. And then there are the tech startups. I don't have a favorite right now, but here are a bunch that I've found.
Hey, editing me here, and actually my basement flooded and we had to tear out asbestos and stuff, so I'm in an Airbnb and it's really freaking cool looking and big ceilings. But these are the startups I wanted to bring up. Some startups that I've come across include the News Movement, 19th News, Tortoise Media, Puck News, though I don't really follow any of these at this time. Mostly I've just checked the websites to verify they exist. Everyone is always talking about Axios, though I'm not sure that they really count as a startup anymore since they were acquired by Cox Enterprises. I actually do read Axios articles fairly often, but whenever I've asked people about like, oh, where do you get your news? Like what startups? Everybody always brings up Axios. And also Ground News is really interesting, though again, I haven't really been using it. They try to help people see news that may be outside of their political bubbles. So they'll show articles from left-leaning, right-leaning, or centrist news organizations to basically give you an idea of what is happening outside of your political social media bubbles that you've been arbitrarily placed in.
And there have been two pretty notable and recent failures that I want to bring up. Artifact and The Messenger both only lasted for a year or less. They both got a tremendous amount of funding. They got some real hot shots involved. Artifact was founded by the founders of Instagram. And both had really gorgeous interfaces, but both had bad business models or just customer acquisition strategy. Now, I never tested out The Messenger, but I did play around with Artifact before it shut down. I really like the user interface of Artifact, and I probably would have used it more, but my issue with it was that it was finding all the articles I wanted to read, which was great, but then I would click onto them and it would take me to a different website where I would have to pay to sign up for a new subscription model to read one article. So while I tried to use it and I integrated it with my two subscriptions that I have, the New York Times and the Star Tribune, I really wasn't able to read the vast majority of stories that I wanted to read, and that ended up being a big bummer. And I didn't want to have to pay for like 10 more newspaper subscriptions if I just wanted to read one specific article. Now, The Messenger was different. They wanted to create basically a new news organization that was digital focused, and they got a lot of money right away. They had a really beautiful app, and they paid people well above market rate, which I think is probably the biggest mistake that they made. Their goal was to try to create a very centrist paper that just gave you the facts and was very straightforward and didn't really have all the bells and whistles. And from what I understand, they did pretty well, but they never made any money, and they ended up running out of money and not being able to raise any more funding, which is why they shut down. And that's something that I really like to remind startup founders is sometimes the startups who get a ton of money really early on and you're like, wow, look at all these things that they're doing. Sometimes they don't get much further because they never actually do the work that is needed to get those users. They try to skip some of the basics by throwing a ton of money on it, and it typically doesn't work. But one startup that isn't throwing just oodles and oodles of money at the problem and is actually thinking about this pretty thoughtfully is, you guessed it, Chuck Peters. So here you go, Chuck.
So what is Ambit, and what do you hope that Ambit can do for journalism in the future?
So Ambit uses the tools of social media to connect community members to community leaders. And what that really looks like in practice is that when you go on social media and you follow individuals who put content out on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, it's really hard to understand, who is this person? Are they trustworthy? Do I have to do my own research offline in order to figure out, is this something that I'm able to trust? Ambit does that work for you so that you're able to follow journalists that have credentials, have verification, and are able to, are authorized to speak on some of the issues that they're posting out. What we're doing specifically for local news is we're committed to giving 50% of whatever digital advertising revenue we can generate back to local journalists who post on our platform. You might say, well, how does that work? Doesn't that inspire clickbait, or the most views gets the most content? And no, that's not the way that this works. Similar to how social media has like a like or a retweet button, Ambit uses a useful button. And our goal is to give the users on our platform information that they can use on a day-to-day basis, and then incentivizing the journalists to tailor their content towards what people in the community want to know about. So for example, the number of times that a button is clicked that says this content was useful, the percentage of useful posts for that journalist or that news organization is multiplied by the total payout pool. And then that's what we use to give content back to local media to make sure that they can survive beyond this digital environment that we operate in. Speaking of tech, when you look at YouTube's partnership program and how they pay content creators, we're effectively taking that same approach and saying we'll pay our content creators, but our content creators just happen to be local journalists who have a verified role in our community.
So to wrap this up, what can we do? As a news consumer, there are a few things that we can do. First is, if the news has been stressing you out, please take care of yourself first. Literally, while making this video, I had to turn off my notifications from the New York Times because I got like 4 notifications from the New York Times while making this video, and it's just super distracting and it can be really stressful, especially when there's horrible, horrible news going on in the world. So if this is you and you want to support journalism, you want to be informed, but you don't want to be stressed out, I suggest turning off your notifications and making a specific time in the day that you consume news. I personally like to read email newsletters in the morning, and then I typically follow a few YouTube news shows in the evening, up at night, and then follow that with some comedy. Cause yeah. And second, make an effort to support your local news if you have the means to. I personally subscribe to the Star Tribune for all of my local news and the New York Times for national and international news that I believe that I can trust. And the reason why I really stress trying to support local newspapers is because these are the organizations that are in trouble. The smallest organizations are okay, especially if they have a really good niche, and larger national or international publications have typically figured things out. Like the New York Times is going to be okay, but local papers or state papers are definitely the ones that are highest at risk. And as Adam Conover so eloquently put it,
when there are less people discovering and producing the news, we as a society know less about the world around us. The less reporters in your city working full-time, the easier it is for bad actors to do bad things, for corporations to manipulate public policy, and for corruption to run rampant in your city government. I mean, somebody needs to actually go to those boring-ass Board of Supervisor meetings because it sure isn't going to be me or you. So where journalism dies, the rich and powerful win.
However, if you're watching because you are hoping to be a startup founder someday, or you want to work in tech, or you want to solve problems like these are my challenges for you. I want to remind you to be an early adopter and experiment with new platforms. There are tons of founders who are trying to build in this space who are struggling to acquire users. And you never know when you're going to find the next up-and-coming big tech company. So don't be afraid to explore, test out a new product for a few days or a month or so, and then make your decisions from there. Next, think about ways that people can consume news that lowers their stress but increases positive engagement and also better educates the public. This is an incredibly serious issue that deserves our attention. And if you're a founder who's looking for an idea, or if you're an investor who is looking for companies to support, I think it is absolutely vital that we consider startups like these. And again, the trends that I'm noticing is that the smaller and more nimble organizations are doing better than the larger or medium-sized ones. But what we haven't yet figured out is how do we get these types of organizations to scale so that we can have local news in as many different locations as possible. Do you think you can crack the code? I hope so. Let me know what your proposed solutions are in the comments down below, especially if you have ideas, but you don't necessarily know if you are the person to act on those solutions. Thank you so much for watching. In case you don't know me, hi, I'm Carolyn, and this is my tech and startup evaluation show called Swift Start Go. Again, if you did like this video, do like, comment, subscribe, ring that bell so that maybe someday I will have enough subscribers to appease the algorithm gods and get that juicy ad revenue done. Yes, please. Money. And let me know what else you are interested in watching down in the comments below. More AI, specific startups, startup scandals. Curious what you think? Now that Easter is over, I'm trying to get videos out every single week. But yes, as you may have noticed, I am still remarkably inconsistent. working on that with shorter videos. Thanks and see you next time. Bye! Jeez, notifications are really distracting. And that one was from the New York Times. Look at me, ignoring the New York Times while talking about the news.